We're becoming a nation where Aboriginals make less of a prominent role in our public discourse altogether, where we care about them less and give them little attention. We were saying on this side of the House that something needs to change, and something needs to change drastically, and that means giving them huge amounts of rights. But we were offended by the claim that they couldn't have the institutional capacity, because we weren't going to tell them what their institutions should look like. We weren't going to tell them the basis of their governance and why white governance was better than the type of governance they were going to give. 3 things in this speech. Firstly, the moral obligation to give them this land. Secondly, whether this would be a viable and functional state and whether it would help those people. And thirdly, what gives more freedom for Indigenous people to define their own identities and maximise the heterogeneity within their society. So, the moral compensation that we argue. We told you why past generations still continue to have an obligation to future generations, where they continue to accrue the benefits of the discrimination. Their response to this were twofold. Firstly, there was an opposition to those racist policies, and there are continuing to be people in this room, for instance, that oppose racist policies in Indigenous communities. 1, we then do not comprise the majority, because the majority of Australians voted to support the Northern Territory intervention, which we will presume the opposition oppose. Insofar as that is true, the majority of Australians have consented quite directly and have chosen to and should be held liable for that consent. Secondly, we all continue to accrue benefit from the discrimination against Indigenous people. We all stand on land that was taken from them forcibly and against their will. Insofar as that, consent becomes totally irrelevant, because we're all impliedly consenting insofar as we're not voluntarily giving the land back to them, which would be the righteous thing. If they want to concede that the land was illegitimately claimed in the first place, which they seem to have done at this point in their case, they can't then say that the claims have changed. When you recognise the land was illegitimately claimed in the first place, its illegitimacy continues in the future. I had no right to get the land from my forefathers if they weren't from South Africa, and none of us had the rights to get the land from our forefathers at all. Second point. Will this be a functional state, and will it help Indigenous people? They wanted to say there's no benefit for us cutting them off in terms of hospitals and aid. 1, we think Australia would have a huge incentive to give them a huge amount of aid because they wouldn't want the crisis on their doorstep. We give aid to every single Pacific Island nation where the crisis there is far more distant. In fact, the political mobilisation around things like asylum seekers and around our neighbours is often more substantial than our domestic issue of the fact that we have a crisis in terms of Indigenous people. 2, they were going to have more bargaining position in that negotiation when they were a viable state and could represent themselves as a viable state in the international arena. They would be able to, for instance, appeal to international bodies and have the international rights there. 3, it can't get much worse from their current bargaining position in terms of aid. They're at the bottom of the scrap heap. We could only improve them. Fourthly, we also thought they were going to be able to not necessarily need the aid because they could work for themselves and develop more capital for themselves so that they could become a self-functioning state. They then wanted to say they're going to lack the institutional capacity to be able to build that state. 1, we never thought the institutional capacity looked like what we in this room might think it looks like. We think institutional capacity can mean being able to form the type of government that you want to form. I'll discuss that more later in my speech. They wanted to say there's less imperative now because we're less racist. As I told you in my introduction, the reality is it gets pushed further and further. But that's not the point anyway. It doesn't matter if we're getting closer to a better system. We're still so far away from the type of equality that we demand that we think the obligation and the imperative still continues to exist. We're not willing to wait for the slow march while we screw over generation after generation of Indigenous people right now. They wanted to say there was going to be an elite of Indigenous people in these communities who would be able to control. They said this elite was going to be the people who currently live in the Northern Territory. 1, this needs to be compared against the elite that currently controls Indigenous issues, which is the elite of white people, an elite that they feel no connection to. I'll discuss later why we think there are some commonalities and some connections they do feel to Indigenous communities altogether, but also we thought this was a total assertion this elite would ever arise. We think they were probably going to care about other Indigenous people and recognise the common oppression that they had suffered. So now, my substantive material. Why this would maximise the freedom to define Indigenous identities. And this goes to the heart of the opposition's case, because they want to say we are homogenising the way Indigenous people will form their identities. We maximise their freedom on this side of the House. Why is that? 1, we allowed them to decide the balance between an overarching governmental structure in this state and individual communities having more autonomy within these states. We're allowing them to define the type of governance structure they want in these states. So if, for instance, they don't want a central government that's going to have more power and they would rather vest more power in individual communities, we're giving them that right. We think here they're balancing 2 competing concerns. 1 is their recognition that they are diverse people, which as a result, it comes from the fact that, 1, they have They did live differently before white colonisation, and two, they have different narratives around different things within the Dreamtime, but they also will be recognising that there are some degrees of commonality at this point in the Indigenous community. We never thought they were perfectly heterogeneous, as the opposition wanted to claim. We think, for instance, they have a homogenous experience of white oppression against Aboriginal people. They were all oppressed as one people, and we have treated them as one people. They have come to rally against this as a point of pride. They have voluntarily opted into this as a point of pride. Secondly, they have some common history, both ancient and modern. Some common history of the type of landscape they experienced before white colonisation and the types of problems they face now. Three, they have similar approaches to narrative formation and approaches to the way that land is constructed, even if their exact land and narratives are not identical. We think those commonalities could be balanced by those people, and they could decide how homogenous and how heterogeneous they want to be. We would give them the power to opt into that decision and not disempower them in order to prove some point about their heterogeneity. Secondly, we allow them to recapture the role of land in their identity. We would like to say that Indigenous connections with land are far more malleable than we might be willing to accept or be able to relate to. For instance, it is the case that the vast majority of Indigenous tribes were migratory at the time of white colonisation. That is one of the reasons why it's very hard for them to prove land rights case. But it also goes to proving that they didn't necessarily have a connection with the land that they lived in right now, but have connection with land as a concept generally in the way they form narratives and inscribe those narratives on the land more broadly. In that circumstance, multiple communities, for instance, had common narratives around particular locations. For instance, things like Uluru. In that circumstance, we think when they're given the power to form new conceptions of property rights that aren't like lost when you move around another area, like you suddenly lose your right to that other land because it can be claimed by somebody else. We think they can form their property rights themselves within this autonomous state through the process that they choose. They will be able to form it in ways that are most productive for their identity formation. We know that land is incredibly important to their narratives and their identity and their connection of spirituality through that. We're happy to give them that power. They're never going to be able to reconcile that with white Anglo-Saxon common law. The opposition wanted to tell you, we're not going to be able to help them all, we can only help those people who are in the Northern Territory. For the reason that I told you that there are commonalities between Indigenous people across Australia generally, we think they will feel some sense of commonality with those people who do live in the Northern Territory, but also the people in the Northern Territory will feel some commonality with the people who are living in Redfern in Sydney or living in other Aboriginal communities. That commonality comes from the oppression that white people have done for them. We would allow them to decide how much of that commonality and how much of that diversity should dominate their identity. Also, they want to claim there'll be homogeneity of identity. One, for all the reasons I gave you before, there won't be a homogeneous identity. But two, we think individuals could opt into having a homogeneous identity if they chose so. So if I wanted to be like a stereotypical gay, and if I thought there should be an idea of a stereotypical gay, it would be incumbent upon me to opt into that stereotypical conception. That should be open to me. There's no reason people have to be heterogeneous if they would opt into being homogeneous. We would allow them the possibility. So insofar as a state would form that was a central government where all Aboriginal issues were decided at top level, we would give them that freedom because we think years of discrimination mean they should be granted that freedom. Thirdly, we think that this is like the heterogeneity of Indigenous communities is going to be less relevant when these people are separate already. The narratives that they constructed in the white media will be at least somewhat being able to not cause harm to these individuals when they no longer have to be exposed to those racist narratives. Mr. Speaker, because we're proud to see Aboriginals given more rights and not allow the status quo to continue, we are so proud to propose.
I'd like to thank